What happens when a Hollywood star known for her dry wit and unfiltered honesty sits across from one of television's most outspoken political commentators? Nobody expected the conversation to become the most talked-about moment of the week. But when Dakota Johnson arrived on the set, what began as a routine interview quickly turned into a tense exchange that left the audience silent, the host scrambling, and social media buzzing for days. Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The cameras rolled as the hosts welcomed Dakota Johnson to the table. The audience applauded warmly while Dakota smiled and waved before taking her seat. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward first. "Dakota, it's good to have you back." Dakota smiled. "It's good to be back." Joy Behar immediately jumped in. "You always seem so calm when you come on these shows. I don't know how you do it." The audience laughed. Dakota shrugged. "I fake it really well." More laughter followed. Sunny Hostin smiled. "That's called being an actress." Dakota laughed. "Exactly." The opening minutes felt relaxed. The panel discussed Dakota's latest project, her recent interviews, and how she balanced work with her personal life. Alyssa Farah Griffin then steered the conversation in a different direction. "You've been pretty vocal recently about celebrity culture and public expectations. Do you think celebrities sometimes complain too much about fame?" The audience reacted with a mix of laughter and curiosity. Dakota tilted her head. "That's a broad question." Alyssa nodded. "It is. But I'm curious because sometimes people hear actors talking about how difficult fame is, and the average person sitting at home is working 2 jobs and struggling with bills." A few audience members applauded. Dakota listened carefully. "That's fair." Alyssa continued. "So do you think there's a disconnect sometimes?" Dakota paused. "I think there can be." The audience seemed surprised by the answer. Alyssa smiled. "So you agree?" Dakota nodded. "Sure. Sometimes there is." The exchange remained friendly. But Alyssa wasn't finished. "Then why do you think so many celebrities continue talking about how hard their lives are?" A brief silence settled over the table. Dakota smiled politely. "Because they're being asked." The audience burst into laughter. Even Whoopi laughed. Alyssa smiled too, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied. "That's a fair point." Dakota continued. "I mean, if someone asks me about my experience, I'm going to answer honestly." "Of course. But answering honestly doesn't mean I'm saying my life is harder than someone else's." The audience applauded. Whoopi nodded. "That's true." Alyssa leaned forward. "But don't you think some celebrities lose touch with reality?" The audience reacted immediately. Dakota looked thoughtful. "I think some people lose touch with reality." The crowd laughed again. Alyssa smiled. "That's a politician answer." Dakota laughed. "Maybe I've been doing press too long." The atmosphere remained playful, but viewers could feel a subtle tension building. Joy jumped in. "Have you ever met someone in Hollywood who was completely disconnected from normal life?" The audience laughed. Dakota looked around the table. "Do you want names?" The crowd erupted. Whoopi covered her face laughing. "Oh no." Dakota grinned. "I'm kidding." Alyssa smiled. "For a second I thought we were getting headlines." "You already are," Dakota replied. The audience roared. Even Alyssa laughed at that. For a few moments the conversation shifted back to lighter topics. But then Alyssa returned to the earlier discussion. "I think what people struggle with is that celebrities have enormous platforms. Sometimes when they talk about everyday problems, it can sound tone-deaf." Dakota nodded. "I understand that. Do you?" The question immediately changed the energy. The audience quieted. Dakota looked directly at Alyssa. "Yes." Alyssa continued. "Because from the outside, it can appear that someone with wealth, influence, and opportunities doesn't really understand what average Americans deal with." The room became noticeably quieter. Whoopi glanced between them. Dakota took a second before responding. "I think that's a dangerous assumption." A few audience members murmured. Alyssa folded her hands. "How so?" "Because you're assuming people stop being human when they become successful." The audience applauded. Alyssa waited. Dakota continued. "Money solves certain problems." "Absolutely." "Agreed. But it doesn't solve every problem." The audience nodded. "And honestly, I think comparing struggles is usually a mistake." Alyssa responded quickly. "I'm not comparing struggles." "It kind of sounds like you are." The audience reacted with a collective, "Oh." Whoopi leaned back. "There it is." Dakota wasn't smiling now, though her tone remained calm. "You asked why celebrities talk about challenges." "Yes." And then you suggested those challenges shouldn't be discussed because other people have harder lives. Alyssa immediately answered, I didn't say they shouldn't be discussed. Dakota nodded. Okay, but I do think perspective matters. Of course it does. The exchange became sharper. Neither woman raised her voice. That somehow made the tension more noticeable. Sunny stepped in. I think both things can be true. The audience applauded. Sunny continued. You can acknowledge privilege and still acknowledge personal difficulties. Dakota pointed toward Sunny. Exactly. Alyssa nodded. I agree with that. For a moment it looked like the discussion might settle down. Then Alyssa added one more thought. But I also think public figures sometimes expect sympathy they haven't earned. The audience reacted instantly. Dakota's eyebrows lifted. Earned, Alyssa clarified. I mean from the public. Dakota leaned back slightly. So people need to earn the right to talk about their experiences? Alyssa opened her mouth. Well, because that sounds strange. The audience applauded loudly. Whoopi looked toward the crowd. They woke up this morning. Laughter filled the studio. Alyssa smiled but remained focused. What I'm saying is that public reaction depends on relatability. Dakota nodded. That's different. Alyssa crossed her arms lightly. Maybe that's what I meant. Dakota smiled. Then we're probably arguing about different things. The audience laughed again. Whoopi pointed toward Dakota. That's actually true. Joy chimed in. Half the arguments on television are people arguing about different things. The audience applauded. The tension eased slightly, but viewers could still feel an unresolved energy between Dakota and Alyssa. Alyssa took another turn. Can I ask something honestly? Dakota nodded. Sure. When people criticize celebrities for being out of touch, does that bother you? Dakota thought for a moment. Not really. Why not? Because sometimes they're right. The audience reacted with surprise. Alyssa seemed caught off guard. Dakota continued. And sometimes they're completely wrong. The room stayed silent. The problem is when people think they know everything about someone they've never met. The audience applauded again. Alyssa listened carefully. Dakota added, I don't know what someone watching at home is going through. Right. And they don't know what I'm going through. The crowd applauded louder. Whoopi nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. For the first time, Alyssa didn't immediately respond. She appeared to be considering Dakota's point. The audience sensed the shift. But before anyone could move on to another topic, Alyssa leaned forward one more time. Then let me ask you this. Dakota looked at her. If you think people make assumptions about celebrities, do celebrities make assumptions about ordinary people too? The audience immediately went quiet. Dakota looked across the table. The expression on her face changed. She smiled slightly, but it wasn't the same relaxed smile from earlier. Now that's actually a good question. The audience reacted. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. Oh boy. Dakota folded her hands on the table and prepared to answer. The studio suddenly felt much quieter than it had at the start of the segment. And what she said next would completely change the direction of the conversation. Dakota looked across the table at Alyssa for a moment before answering. Now that's actually a good question. The audience settled in. Alyssa nodded. I think it's fair. It is fair, Dakota replied. Because I think assumptions happen in every direction. Alyssa seemed pleased with the answer. So celebrities do make assumptions about regular people? Some do. The audience murmured. Dakota continued. Some celebrities assume everybody understands their lifestyle. Right. And some people assume celebrities live in some magical world where nothing bad ever happens. The audience applauded. Whoopi nodded. Both are true. Dakota smiled. Exactly. Alyssa leaned forward. So then what's the solution? Dakota laughed. If I knew that, I'd probably be running for office. The audience erupted. Even Alyssa laughed. Trust me, you don't want that job. Definitely not. The conversation seemed lighter again. But Alyssa wasn't finished exploring the topic. Can I be honest about something? Dakota nodded. Sure. I think there's frustration from viewers because celebrities often have the loudest microphones. The audience listened carefully. And sometimes average people feel talked down to. Dakota's expression became thoughtful. That's fair. The audience seemed surprised by how often she was agreeing. Alyssa continued. Especially when celebrities speak about politics or social issues. Dakota nodded slowly. Okay. Alyssa looked around the table. People wonder why actors suddenly become experts. A few audience members applauded. Dakota immediately smiled. We're definitely not experts. Laughter filled the studio. That's probably the most accurate thing anyone has said today. Even Alyssa laughed. But Dakota wasn't finished. Although I don't think someone needs to be an expert to care about something. The audience applauded. That's true, Sunny added. Dakota continued. Every citizen has opinions. Sure. The difference is that people hear mine because I happen to be sitting in front of cameras. The audience nodded. Alyssa listened. Dakota turned slightly toward her. But I don't think being famous automatically makes someone's opinion more important. The crowd applauded louder. Whoopi pointed toward Dakota. That's a good answer. Alyssa nodded. I respect that. For the first time, there seemed to be genuine agreement between them. Then Joy decided to jump in. Can I make things worse? The audience laughed immediately. Whoopi shook her head. That's usually how Joy starts. Joy grinned. Dakota, do you think social media has made everyone more judgmental? Dakota laughed. Without question. The audience applauded. Joy nodded. That's my feeling too. Dakota continued. Everybody's reacting to headlines now. Exactly. Most people don't even watch full interviews. The audience responded with applause. Alyssa nodded reluctantly. That's true. Dakota looked toward her. I've had people get angry about things I never actually said. Welcome to television, Alyssa replied. The crowd laughed. Fair. Whoopi leaned in. That's not new. That's been happening forever. True, Dakota agreed. But social media makes it happen faster. The discussion seemed to be moving toward common ground. Then Alyssa brought the conversation back to a more personal place. Have you ever felt misunderstood by the public? Dakota laughed immediately. Every week. The audience burst out laughing. Alyssa smiled. Seriously. I am serious. More laughter followed. Dakota crossed her arms playfully. I think everybody gets misunderstood. Not on the scale you do. Dakota paused. Maybe. Alyssa nodded. So how do you deal with that? The audience grew quieter. Dakota thought carefully. Honestly, yeah. I stopped trying to control it. The room remained silent. Dakota continued. Because it's impossible. Interesting. If someone wants to believe something about you, they're usually going to believe it. The audience applauded. Sunny nodded. That's true. Dakota continued. You can spend your whole life explaining yourself. Right. Or you can just live your life. The applause grew louder. Alyssa looked thoughtful. But isn't that easier when you're successful? The audience immediately reacted. Whoopi looked toward Alyssa. There she goes again. Laughter spread across the studio. Dakota smiled. I knew we weren't done. The crowd laughed harder. Alyssa smiled too. No, seriously. Dakota nodded. Okay, I think people with power have more freedom to ignore criticism. Dakota leaned back. Sometimes success makes criticism louder. The audience quieted. Alyssa listened carefully. Dakota continued. The more visible you become, the more strangers feel entitled to define you. The room became noticeably more serious. That's not a complaint. Okay, it's just reality. The audience applauded. Alyssa folded her hands. But do you understand why some people struggle to sympathize with that? Dakota nodded. Yes. Because everyone has their own problems. Alyssa nodded. Exactly. Dakota paused. But sympathy isn't supposed to be a competition. The audience erupted into applause. Sunny immediately joined in clapping. Whoopi nodded. There it is. Dakota continued. I can feel bad for someone who's struggling financially. Of course. And they can feel bad for someone dealing with something completely different. The audience applauded again. You don't have to choose. Alyssa remained quiet. Dakota looked directly at her. I think that's where these conversations go wrong. How? People act like compassion is limited. The audience applauded loudly. Dakota continued. As if understanding one person's difficulties somehow takes away from someone else's. The room erupted again. Even some audience members stood briefly. Whoopi smiled. They like that. Alyssa took a breath before responding. I don't disagree with that. The audience seemed relieved. But the crowd immediately laughed. Dakota laughed too. There's always a but. There is. Alyssa smiled. I still think celebrities sometimes create their own problems. The audience reacted loudly. Some applause. Some groans. Dakota tilted her head. What does that mean? Alyssa answered carefully. I mean, sometimes fame-related problems only exist because people choose fame. The room became very quiet. Sunny raised her eyebrows. Joy looked interested. Whoopi watched closely. Dakota took a second before answering. So because someone chooses a career, their challenges become less legitimate? Alyssa hesitated. No, that's kind of what it sounds like. The audience let out a collective gasp. Alyssa immediately jumped in. No, that's not what I'm saying. Dakota remained calm. Okay, what I'm saying is that fame comes with known consequences. Dakota nodded. Sure. People know what they're signing up for. Dakota smiled slightly. Do they? The audience reacted. Alyssa paused. Dakota continued. Because I don't remember getting a handbook. The crowd burst into laughter. Even Whoopi laughed loudly. Dakota kept going. I don't remember the meeting where somebody explained exactly how life would change. The audience applauded. Alyssa smiled despite herself. Fair point. Dakota shrugged. Most people figure it out as they go. The room settled again. Then Alyssa made one final observation. Maybe. She paused. But ordinary people don't always have the luxury of making mistakes publicly. The audience became silent. Dakota looked directly at her. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Even the hosts seemed to sense that the conversation had reached a turning point. Dakota finally nodded. You know what? What? I actually agree with that. The audience seemed surprised. Alyssa looked surprised too. Dakota continued. I think that's one of the hardest parts of public life. The room stayed quiet. Not because it's harder than what other people deal with. Alyssa listened. But because every mistake becomes part of your identity. The audience applauded softly. Dakota leaned forward. And honestly, yeah, I think that's something everybody should think about before judging someone they've never met. The applause grew louder. The audience was fully behind her now. Alyssa opened her mouth as if preparing another question. Then she paused. For the first time during the entire interview, she seemed unsure whether to push further. Whoopi noticed immediately. Oh, you've got another one. The audience laughed. Alyssa smiled. I do. Dakota laughed. I knew it. Alyssa looked directly at her. This might be the toughest question of the day. The room instantly became quiet. Dakota sat back. Okay. Alyssa took a breath. Do you think Hollywood has become so insulated that it no longer understands the people it's trying to speak to? A wave of reactions swept through the audience. Some applause. Some gasps. Sunny looked over at Dakota. Joy leaned forward. Whoopi's eyebrows shot up. And Dakota's expression changed immediately. Because this wasn't a question about celebrities anymore. It was a question about the entire industry she belonged to. And everyone in the studio knew her answer could change the tone of the entire interview. The audience remained silent as Alyssa's question hung in the air. Do you think Hollywood has become so insulated that it no longer understands the people it's trying to speak to? Dakota sat quietly for a few seconds. Nobody interrupted. Even Joy, who normally jumped in with a joke, stayed silent. Dakota finally nodded. Sometimes. A murmur spread through the audience. Alyssa looked surprised. Really? Sure. The audience listened carefully. Dakota continued. I think every industry can become insulated. Alyssa nodded. But specifically Hollywood? Dakota smiled. You really want me to get in trouble today? The audience laughed. Whoopi pointed across the table. She came prepared. More laughter followed. Dakota leaned forward. Look, there are absolutely people in Hollywood who spend most of their time around other people in Hollywood. Fair. And when that happens, your perspective can get smaller. The audience applauded. Alyssa nodded. So then critics are right? Sometimes. The crowd reacted immediately. Dakota continued before anyone could jump in. But critics are also wrong sometimes. Alyssa waited. Dakota crossed her arms. The problem is that people love simple explanations. What do you mean? If a movie fails, people say Hollywood is disconnected. Okay, if a movie succeeds, suddenly Hollywood understands everyone again. The audience laughed and applauded. That's true, Joy said. Dakota smiled. People decide the conclusion before they examine the evidence. The audience reacted positively. Alyssa looked thoughtful. But don't you think there's a growing divide? Dakota nodded. Yes. The room became quiet again. Between who? Everybody. The audience murmured. Dakota continued. Not just celebrities and regular people. Okay, people are divided politically. True. Socially. True. Economically. The audience applauded. And technology has made it easier for people to stay inside their own bubbles. Sunny immediately nodded. I agree with that. Dakota pointed toward her. Exactly. Alyssa folded her hands. But Hollywood does have cultural influence. Of course. So shouldn't there be responsibility attached to that? Dakota answered immediately. Yes. The audience seemed surprised by the direct answer. There absolutely should. Alyssa nodded. Then how do you define that responsibility? Dakota paused. Listening. The room stayed quiet. Listening. Listening more than talking. The audience applauded. Whoopi smiled. That sounds simple. It is simple. People don't do it. The audience laughed. Dakota continued. I think everybody spends too much time trying to win arguments. Alyssa looked amused. You're saying that on a talk show. The audience exploded with laughter. Dakota laughed. I realized the irony. Whoopi threw her hands up. We're all unemployed now. More laughter filled the studio. The mood softened for a moment. Then Alyssa shifted gears. Can I challenge something? Dakota nodded. Sure. You talk a lot about listening. Okay. But some people would argue that celebrities only listen when criticism affects them personally. The audience reacted immediately. Dakota looked directly at Alyssa. Some celebrities probably do. Alyssa seemed surprised again. Dakota wasn't becoming defensive. Instead, she kept agreeing whenever she thought a point was fair. The audience noticed. Alyssa continued. But that criticism exists for a reason. Absolutely. The room became quiet. Dakota added, I think criticism can be useful. The audience murmured. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. You do? Yes. Most people hate criticism. Dakota laughed. I hate criticism. The crowd laughed. But that doesn't mean it's always wrong. The audience applauded. Whoopi nodded. That's maturity. Dakota smiled. Or exhaustion. The audience laughed again. Alyssa leaned forward. Then what's the criticism of Hollywood that you think is most accurate? The room instantly became silent. Everyone could tell this question mattered. Dakota thought carefully. Well, she paused. I think sometimes Hollywood confuses visibility with importance. The audience reacted. Alyssa sat back slightly. Dakota continued. Just because people are looking at you doesn't mean your opinion matters more. The applause came immediately. Sunny nodded. Joy clapped. Even some audience members stood briefly. Dakota continued. I think that's a trap. Alyssa looked impressed. That's actually a pretty interesting answer. Dakota smiled. It's also probably true for politicians. The audience exploded. Whoopi slapped the table laughing. Sunny covered her face. Joy pointed at Alyssa. Oh, she got you back. The crowd roared with laughter. Alyssa laughed too. Okay. Fair. Dakota smiled. Now we're even. The audience loved it. For the first time all segment, the tension transformed into something different. Mutual respect. But Alyssa wasn't done. She leaned forward one more time. Since we're being honest. Oh no, Dakota said. The audience laughed. Alyssa smiled. What do you think is the biggest misconception people have about you? The room quieted. Dakota looked thoughtful. That's easy. Really? Yeah. The audience waited. Dakota smiled slightly. That I'm always trying to make a statement. The audience listened carefully. Most of the time I'm literally just answering a question. The crowd laughed. She continued. Then somebody writes a headline. More laughter. And suddenly I apparently launched a movement. The audience applauded. Alyssa nodded. I understand that. Dakota looked at her. I think that happens to people in politics too. Alyssa laughed. Every day. The audience laughed along. Whoopi pointed between them. Look at this. They're bonding now. The crowd applauded. The atmosphere felt noticeably different than it had an hour earlier. But then an audience member was handed a microphone for a question. The woman stood. Hi, Dakota. Hi. The audience member smiled nervously. My question is about public criticism. Okay. You seem very confident when people challenge you. Dakota laughed immediately. That's an illusion. The crowd laughed. The woman continued. How do you stay calm? Dakota paused. The answer came slower this time. Honestly, yeah. I remind myself that disagreement isn't the same thing as rejection. The room became completely silent. Even the host stopped moving. Dakota continued. When somebody disagrees with you, it doesn't automatically mean they hate you. The audience applauded softly. And I think we've forgotten that. The applause grew louder. Alyssa nodded slowly. Dakota looked around the table. We've started treating disagreement like a crisis. The audience applauded again. But disagreement can actually be useful. Whoopi smiled. Especially here. The audience laughed. Dakota smiled. Exactly. Alyssa looked at her. You really believe that? Yes. Even after some of our conversation today? Dakota laughed. Especially after some of our conversation today. The audience erupted into applause. Alyssa smiled. For the first time all interview, she appeared genuinely touched by the answer. That's fair. The applause continued. Whoopi looked out at the audience. Well, this took a healthier turn than I expected. The crowd laughed. Joy nodded. Give it a minute. More laughter followed. The producers began signaling that the segment was almost over. But Alyssa had one final thought. One final question. And judging by the look on Dakota's face, she knew it was coming. Alyssa turned toward her. If there's one thing people watching at home should understand about public figures, what would it be? The audience immediately quieted. Dakota looked around the studio. She glanced at Alyssa, then Sunny, then Joy, then Whoopi, and finally toward the audience. Her answer would become the most quoted moment of the entire show. And once she said it, the crowd's reaction would leave the host speechless. The audience immediately quieted. Alyssa looked at Dakota. If there's one thing people watching at home should understand about public figures, what would it be? Dakota sat back in her chair and thought for a moment. The studio was unusually quiet. Even the hosts seemed interested in where she was going to take the answer. Finally, Dakota spoke. I think I'd want people to remember that public figures are still people. The audience listened carefully. She continued. And honestly, I'd say the opposite is true too. Alyssa nodded. What do you mean? Dakota looked toward the audience. I think public figures should remember that the people watching at home are people too. The crowd immediately applauded. Whoopi smiled. That sounds fair. Dakota continued. Sometimes we talk about groups instead of individuals. The room remained quiet. We talk about voters, celebrities, fans, critics, politicians. Alyssa nodded. Right. But every one of those labels belongs to an actual person. The applause grew louder. Sunny joined in clapping. Dakota leaned forward. And when we forget that, conversations get worse. The audience applauded again. Alyssa smiled. So that's the lesson? Dakota laughed. I don't know if it's a lesson. Advice? Maybe. The audience laughed. Dakota continued. I just think life gets easier when you stop assuming the worst about people. The crowd erupted into applause. Whoopi pointed toward Dakota. That right there. The applause continued. Alyssa nodded slowly. You know what? What? I actually agree with that. The audience reacted positively. Dakota smiled. Well, now we've ruined the whole segment. The crowd burst into laughter. Joy immediately jumped in. Don't worry. People online will still find something to fight about. The audience laughed even harder. That's definitely true, Dakota replied. The producers signaled again that they had less than a minute remaining. Whoopi looked toward the camera. Well, Dakota, thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. Alyssa smiled. Seriously, thanks for answering the tough questions. Dakota looked over at her. Thanks for asking them. The audience applauded. Alyssa laughed. I wasn't sure you'd say that. Dakota shrugged. I think difficult conversations are usually better than fake ones. The crowd applauded loudly. Whoopi stood from her chair. That's probably a good place to end. The audience rose to its feet. A long round of applause filled the studio. Dakota waved toward the crowd. The hosts thanked viewers for watching, and moments later the cameras stopped rolling. But the conversation wasn't finished. In fact, it was only beginning. Within minutes, clips from the exchange began appearing across social media. Viewers immediately started debating Dakota's comments. Some praised her calm approach throughout the discussion. Others focused on her exchanges with Alyssa. One clip in particular spread faster than any other. The moment where Dakota said, "Sympathy isn't supposed to be a competition." That quote was shared thousands of times. Viewers on social media called it the strongest point of the entire interview. Another viral moment came when Dakota responded, "People act like compassion is limited." That clip generated huge discussion online. Some viewers argued it perfectly summarized the problem with modern debates. Others praised Dakota for refusing to become defensive even when challenged repeatedly. Meanwhile, another group of viewers praised Alyssa. They argued that she asked questions many people at home wanted answered. Comments appeared across platforms from people saying the conversation felt more honest than most celebrity interviews. Rather than becoming a shouting match, it remained a real disagreement between two people with different perspectives. That was exactly what many viewers found refreshing. Entertainment websites quickly published stories about the segment. Talk show fans debated who made the stronger arguments. Some believed Dakota won the discussion with her calm responses. Others felt Alyssa successfully challenged her viewpoints. Many viewers concluded that neither side really won. Instead, they had a genuine conversation that rarely happens on daytime television. Backstage after the show, reports suggested the atmosphere was far less dramatic than many viewers assumed. Dakota reportedly spent several minutes talking with the hosts before leaving. Several audience members later posted online that the tension looked much stronger on television than it felt inside the studio. One audience member wrote that both women appeared respectful during commercial breaks. Another said they were surprised by how friendly the panel seemed once the cameras stopped. As more clips circulated online, the discussion continued throughout the week. Political commentators weighed in. Entertainment reporters weighed in. Fans weighed in. Critics weighed in. And just as Joy jokingly predicted, everyone seemed to find something different to argue about. Yet one thing remained consistent across most reactions. People were talking about the conversation. Not because of yelling. Not because of insults. Not because someone stormed off the set. But because two people disagreed directly, challenged each other respectfully, and continued talking. In today's media environment, many viewers felt that was unusual enough to become news by itself. Days later, the interview remained one of the most discussed segments of the week. The clips continued accumulating views. Reaction videos appeared. Opinion pieces followed. And viewers kept returning to the same question. Was Dakota right? Was Alyssa right? Or was the real takeaway that meaningful conversations can happen even when people don't fully agree? Whatever side viewers landed on, one thing was certain. The interview left an impression. And for a daytime talk show, that's often what makes a moment memorable. Now we'd love to hear from you. Who do you think made the stronger point during the discussion? Did you agree more with Dakota Johnson's perspective, Alyssa Farah Griffin's questions, or did both make valid arguments? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.